Great pleasure in introducing Dr. Werner Zittel, Chairman of the Board, the Ludwig Bölkow Stiftung. Dr. Werner Zittel is a German consultant with LB Systemtechnik, a München-based consulting company specializing in sustainable energy and transport strategies. The company is also a founding member of the European Business Council for a Sustainable Energy Future, a business NGO which promotes compliance with the Kyoto Protocol and lobbies in support of climate-friendly technologies and policies of climate negotiations. He has a doctorate in physics from the Technical University of Darmstadt and worked at the Max Planck Institute for Quantum Optics. His topic today is energy, economy, and sustainable societal behavior. How these are linked together. Please, a warm welcome for Dr. Zittel.
Before we have had an excellent and motivating presentation, I think, and I'm afraid my talk will be a little more theoretical. It's about the basics behind that all, but I hope to share my views with you, and this helps you to understand a little better what's going on at world levels. I'm sure you have realized about the last 10 years the number of crises at world has increased by some number, and I guess it's really related to what I'm talking about today. So it's about economic growth, which is important, there's no doubt about, but economic growth of course is linked to climate change in a negative way, I would say, and to energy consumption, and this all of course is the backbone of our societal behavior and how we can address our personal lifestyle. So at the end I will have a few remarks on what does it mean for societies, how should it go on. First, it's just an example about the gross domestic product development of the United States over the last 100 years. It's growing, growing, growing. And economic growth in terms of GDP is used as a measure of national welfare for each country, for almost each country. And growth is necessary for some reasons. Mortgage rates have to be paid back. They increase the credit rate which we have to pay. But it's also necessary to reach full employment status. So a zero growth rate does not guarantee full employment. It increases unemployment rates. Theoretical economists have thought about these linkages, and usually it's just the only formula. Please apologize for that. So they usually say model the economic growth in terms of such a growth function, which means the more capital you invest, the more you can produce, and the more labor you invest, this is also in favor of rising the production growth. So they tried to test this theory and just on the US GDP development, if they took the number of the laborers which were employed to the capital which was invested, and just tried if it fits to the gross domestic product. And actually I just switch to the next figure. Actually it does not. If you see the broken lines, this is the theoretical model result. And in the 1950s, a famous economist, Solov, had this idea that the difference between the theoretical model and the real development is due to innovation and to invention. If you go back to the last formula, then you see this GDP is related to capital and labor times a factor in front of it. And this factor increases. And once we become more efficient, we need less labor or less capital to produce the same amount of GDP. This sets free some workers which can produce new things, or it also sets free some capital which can be invested into new developments. So this is a basic link in the economic growth and in the background of economic growth. But it has some drawbacks and cannot explain everything. First, if we criticize that model, we see in that theory, and which is still today used by almost all economists when they model the future economic growth. In that theory, economic growth depends only on innovation, capital, and labor which are invested. And this does not coincide with empirical evidence. There's a huge gap sometimes, as we have seen. And most important, not innovation, or at least not in that direct way, innovation is a driver for growth, but the switch to substitute labor work by technical energy, which means energy is almost never included in these theoretical models. And this justification for it is that in GDP terms or in numbers, it accounts for only 2, 3, or 4% of the money which is part of the production costs. So they usually forget about. But of course, it's the physical basics behind, so you never can forget about, and you should and must include it to get it a bit more precise. And there were some people who adapted their theories to that, and included in the growth rate not only capital and employment rate and labor force, but also energy. And what I found out, it matches very well with the developments of the last years. I just give you a few examples. Up is the growth, the GDP growth of the US economy. Left figure is the real development, and the theoretical development, the model development, they almost match, they closely match. You cannot see almost any difference. And at the right-hand side, you see the individual production factors for energy, for labor, and for investments, for capital. And at the low-hand side, it's the same for Japan. So this theory can explain much better what's going on. Energy is one of the driving forces of growth in the past. This is just a detailed example for Germany. We do not use it for the whole economy, but just for a part, for the so-called productive Warenproduzierendes Gewerbe, also producing parts. And the background why this works so well is that energy is much cheaper than labor work, which everybody of you knows. And just to give you an example, 1 barrel of oil, it contains about 1600 kilowatt hours of energy, and a man can work about 100 watt, also per hour, 100 watt of current power. And if we compare it, 1 barrel of oil is equivalent to the working power of 16,000 hours of one person. But 1 barrel of oil costs about $100, and wages are much higher. And that's the major reason behind why manpower was substituted and is substituted by technical energy, and we just switch energy from humans, from human beings to technical energy, to use more oil, more coal, and so on. But now let's turn to climate change. This is completely in contradiction what we need to protect our climate. The business as usual scenario, it asks for growth, because economic growth, it's strongly related to growth in fossil fuels consumption, which means rising emissions, rising greenhouse warming emissions. But on the other hand, what we need to protect our climate is just to reduce that amount of energy, to reduce fossil fuel consumption by at least 50% over the next 40 years. This is a huge challenge, and it will never work, I say, under present economic conditions, because our present economic conditions are fossil fuels are the cheapest way to produce energy, and it's the backbone for growth, for economic growth. So unless this paradigm does not change, unless we have serious problems, and that's just what I'm going on now to talk about. Is there any chance, I said in a positive way, is there any chance that this paradigm will change? The prerequisite of economic growth. Fossil fuels are cheap and abundant. This was the backbone. Now, let's focus on oil, which is by far the most important fuel for the world economy. And now it's a theoretical figure. If you have individual oil fields, as if you produce oil, first you have to find oil fields, then you have to develop them and to take them into production, and then they have a certain lifetime. Oil is finite, everybody knows it. You can see it much better in a single oil field, and it is under pressure, under high pressure. Once you start to produce oil, you put a hole in, and the oil comes out by itself, just due to the high pressure. But the more oil you take out from the ground, the more you reduce the pressure in the ground. And this decreases the growth rate, the flow rate of the oil. And typically, oil fields have a production profile like that. In the beginning, you can very fast increase the production rate, then it slows down. You can attempt any measure you like to increase the pressure artificially and so on, but it doesn't help. The decline rates year by year or day by day declines a bit more. But what the companies are doing is when they develop oil fields in a certain region, of course, they rank them according to their economic profits and take the largest oil fields first. Once these have passed their maximum, no problem, they take the next ones and the next ones and so on. This goes on as long as the large fields are developed, as they are exhausted, as they have passed peak production, and as they cannot find anymore enough new fields which could produce the same amount of oil which has been lost by the declining production of the first ones. This is theoretical. I should give you two examples. This is the oil production in Great Britain and in Norway, where each field with its production rate is shown. You see, very fast production is increased. But let's take the example of UK in the year 2000, when oil prices were at a low level, or in 1999, they reached peak production. And in 2010 or 11, when oil prices were about 7-8 times higher, they couldn't produce the same amount because the fields were exhausted. It's a quite simple aspect. The same holds for Norway and for many fields and regions. And presently, most of the huge oil fields have passed peak production in the world. And what's the problem? We have to substitute these declining oil fields by ever more and faster developments of new fields. But these new fields usually are much, much smaller than the old ones. I give you an example. By far the largest two oil fields have been found in 1938 and 1948 in Saudi Arabia. And they contain about 6 to 7% of all oil which has been found worldwide. And today we know more than 50,000 oil fields. And these two fields are still the backbone of our oil production. Now we can make such an analysis for each country and rank them according when did they pass peak production. And the lower part is the yellow field, and the down parts is the lower 48 states in the United States. Almost nobody has realized that the United States have passed peak production in 1970. Remember, it was just before the oil price crisis in 1973. Then the white areas are Norway and UK and even Mexico. They passed peak production around the year 2000. And so we have, I call it a game, we have ever more countries switch from increasing their production to declining future production profile, and ever less countries have to fill that gap. They must rise their production in a similar way. As long as it works, they can keep the world production flat or maybe even a little increasing. And what we have experienced is, just look to the black area in the top, which is the last field of the conventional oil sources. We reached peak production in about 2005. What's above this black area are so-called unconventional oils in terms of natural gas liquids, which are more closely related to natural gas production and not oil production. And if you remember, since 2004, 2005, economic problems started to rise. And there is, of course, a link between these two developments. Just to show you again a part of this figure before, the thick black line gives you the world crude oil production. It could be increased from 1994 to 2004 almost according to the demand which was rising. But from 2004 on, it could not increase anymore. And look, the lower curve, which represents the oil price, it showed strong increases between 2004 and 2008 by almost tripling or quadrupling, but it had almost no reaction to the oil supply, which is a clear indicator that it is simply not possible to dig out much more oil. And what you have heard about in the last years about tight oil developments in the United States, and they will increase the oil production or even shale gas production, it's nothing more than a desperate attempt of the oil companies to play that game a bit longer. Here is still a same relation. Above you see the development of the oil price since 1960 in nominal and real terms, but you see just from 2000 onwards, the oil price was rising much more steeply and different from the pattern which was in the past. And of course, this is relinked. Remember, in the year 2000, Norway passed peak production, Great Britain passed peak production, and many other countries. So it's getting more and more problematic to dig out that oil, what the economy needs. And in the lower part, I have shown the change, the growth rate, the year-over-year growth rate for the United States. Above the bottom line is positive, and below it's a negative value. And you see almost each time when we had a sudden price spike, it resulted in a crisis, in a phase of recession. And if it takes a 10 years average growth rate, which is shown by the blue line, it declines from decade to decade. So it's getting always more difficult to keep the economy running when the production to extract oil become always harder and more expensive. And let's just sketch what's going on in the future. It will look like that we are maybe at, or maybe already we have passed, but certainly we are very close to peak oil production. Exactly, we do not know it at the moment. We only can see it in backward. It's also due because some statistics are not so clear and as they should be. But nevertheless, we should expect that in 20 years world oil production is much less than it was in the past, that it is today. And this you should see in contrast to the fact that ever more countries like oil that are developing. This you can see in this graph, which shows the oil consumption of the OECD countries, which is the uppermost curve, and the non-OECD countries. So both together are the two shares of the world oil consumption. And you see a considerable split in the developing countries, the green line. They could grow the oil consumption even in 2008, 2009, when we had a recession in the world economy. But this was only possible because the economic leading countries, the OECD countries, could reduce their oil consumption. I must say, had to reduce. It was a game which prices had to rise so fast that the consumption was pressed downward. And this was one of the major reasons behind the recession in 2008, 2009. Remember this, go back this oil price spike at 2008. It was just the trigger for that recession. It was not the there were certainly some other reasons, but this was the trigger for it. And what the crisis, what we still have today, even in Southern Europe or so, is probably a part of that game, because the weaker economies are hit first when oil prices are high. So, what are the consequences of peak oil? Remember, oil is the backbone also of transport. 95% of our cars and trucks run on oil, even more than 95%. So once we have problems with oil supplies, we of course will have problems with transport. But it also has an impact of mining, because this pattern, do the easy things first, and does not only hold for oil fields, but also for mines, for copper mining, for many other things. And they have to continuously to switch from high-grade ores to lower-grade ores. But low-grade ores means you need more energy to extract it. And when this matches, it comes together with declining oil supplies, of course it has a consequence. And the easiest or the fastest to see consequence is that prices probably might rise. And therefore it has an impact on fuel prices. But even more, even when we have a peak oil and the world more and more is split into countries which still can supply, still can export oil, and others which have to import that oil. But and therefore also the economic development of these countries is split. The one part has to pay ever more to get oil, the other part earns ever more money just because they sell oil. And so they can increase their domestic growth. They still can buy cars and run them when others are in trouble. So their domestic production rises even faster than, which has the consequence that the exports at world markets decline much, much faster than the world oil production. And I would say, just in a rough way, I would not be surprised when in 2030 oil at the world markets is a very, very expensive quantity. And also, of course, has impacts on food production and food distribution, as a lot of energy, of fossil energy, goes into food production. And this is highly unsustainable. And of course, it has some consequences. And even here, we can not prove, but see some relations to the Arab Spring, because the riots began due to high food prices. It was not the main reason, but it was again the trigger. Some other reasons, of course, were much more important, but this was the trigger. The people had to pay so much for their food that they couldn't spend it anymore. So let's summarize that part. We are at the beginning of a fundamental structural change, which in the world never has been before and never will be afterwards. We are in a transition phase from each year a bit more supply from oil, minerals and so on, to each year a bit less supply. This is a severe stress to our economic system. Just to show it graphically, at the left-hand side, it's a sketch of the supply of almost all fossil fuels. Maybe we can dig out a bit more coal and gas, but the analysis shows that even here we are not so close to the limits as with oil, but we are not hundreds of years away. We are a decade maybe away, or 2 decades. At the other hand, we have a rising share of renewable energy, where we can calculate theoretical potentials, how much we could get out. But this is not the truth. The truth is, how fast can we develop these potentials, how much money can we spend it, and so on. How can we also feed or supply the fuels for transport, which are hard to get from renewable fuels. So if we match these two figures together, if we make an overlay, then it's very certain that declining fossil fuel supply will result in a gap. At least for a phase, you will have a declining total world energy supply with severe consequences. And I just would state it, the world stands at crossroads of its future. It's really the whole economic future. But now let's add a few more consequences out of that. Our economic system needs growth. This is endangered, and oil price spikes in the past always triggered an economic recession, and very certain this will remain so in the future. This will have severe geopolitical consequences, which I don't like to talk about at the moment, but also the social stability inside the countries is endangered. Countries with weaker economy are hit first. Our economic rules are developed to support a growing consumption. This was made because everybody thinks it's okay, and it was okay as long as we can feed that rising demand by a rising supply. But just when we switch from every year a bit more to every year a bit less, the system is probably doomed to fail. What we need is nothing less than new economic rules, and probably this also involves new social structures. And just want to give example, degrowth economies, maybe you have already heard about, or you can find a lot in the internet, which means economic systems which are still stable when the resource consumption at least is not increased anymore. And two positive examples what's already developing in the states, Greece and Spain, which are in a huge economic crisis, is just that social networks are coming up to switching out the huge food traders, so that the farmers sell their products directly to the consumers, and so regional networks are growing. But it has Also another consequence, which of course you may realize, but there are two British epidemiologists who have made a lot of statistics about wealth and relation to the richness of the people. And what they have listed the countries here, almost all OECD countries. The left figure shows at the bottom line the national income, how rich is the country, and the upper line is, or axis is the health status. Do the people are they healthy in the country? And you see not such a strong correlation. But once he sorted the same data, looked to the countries which have the largest difference between poor and rich, between high and low income, he found a fundamental relation that the larger was the spreading between the low and high income, the higher also was the state of health problems, of economic, of social problems, of educational problems, and so on. Which means not the level of GDP is important, but just the equality level, more or less. How far is the spreading between poor and rich people? So what we need is not GDP, we need a measure for happiness. And just there's one example in the world which does that, it's Bhutan. We need health and food are important, not money. And just an example where Cuba and North Korea, which after the breakdown of the Soviet Empire had they lost just half of their oil supply. And Cuba reacted quite differently, creating sustainable structures at that level. We need economic stability and ecology and social stability. In the consequence, this means fast switch to renewable energies. Equal societies are more stable than unequal societies, which means lower gap between upper and lower classes. Social networks are a key element, and stakeholders of companies should not be anonymous stock markets, but employees or regional citizens with regional responsibility. So not the maximization of profits is the key, but the maximization of social welfare and stability. And my last sentence, unless we find a new economic frame, we will not solve future economic problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zittel. We can take a couple of questions, so if anybody, yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Could you extend your arguments also to peak coal?
Yeah, we have analyzed that very well. What we have experienced over the last 30 years, the reserves of coal have been dramatically reduced. In 1980 around, we had a reserve to production ratio of more than 1,000 years, and now it's about 120 years. So the reserves are not that large, which many people believe. And here we have the same rules as for oil. Do the easy thing first, which means the coal mines which are easy to develop, which are large, which have high quality, high content of energy, which are close to the markets, and these are exhausted in Europe, in whole Europe, but also South Africa is close at its peak, and it's the peak of coal production already has been passed in the United States, which has by far the largest coal reserves. And statistics, if you look critically to the statistics, you see these are overstated, these statistics. They just count everything which is in the ground, but probably what will never be digged out because of low quality and so on. Then just two last sentences, China and India, which are one of the largest consumers. China by far is the largest consumer. They are also the largest reserve holders. And China switched from a coal exporting country about 8 years ago, and now it's the largest coal importing country. So it's the same game. At world markets, we will run into problems.
We have one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. You're familiar with the term critical mass, I'm sure. So my first question, which actually is my last, was, pardon? My first, actually it's the last question, but I'm going to make it the first one. So when will we reach critical mass in this situation? All right. Now, the next question is, could you go back to that slide where you mentioned the 2% energy factor?
Which one was?
I think it was one of the first ones.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Here something.
Yeah, right. Unfortunately, I had to leave and go back to the office to get something. And when I came back, I heard you talking about transportation costs, energy, and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to find out what would be the motive behind pushing this 2% energy aspect of the equation when, in terms of production, the transportation, the products, whatever you're producing, all of that includes more or less oil. In every production process, oil is there. And I would think that the 2% figure would be very, very misleading. I want to know what the real figure is, if you know what it is or what it could be. And why is it that people would represent something as ridiculous as that, as this 2%?
Yeah, that's due to in terms of money, of value of the oil. It's not the energy amount, how much energy is in the products, but in terms of money, how much cost does the production cost? The labor costs, in capital costs for depreciation of the production plants is much more important than the price of energy. That's the point for the 2 or 3%.
Well, I mean, what I'm talking about is, do they have chairs? Do they have light fixtures? Do they have a rug?
Yeah, of course.
All of that's included.
It's all included.
In the 2%.
It's just in terms of money. It's the salaries for the employees are much more important, and that's the reason why they always try to press the salaries down. That's a more important factor than energy.
One other aspect.
At moment, and just at economic terms.
You didn't once mention, I mean, in terms of the economic system, that it's based on plunder. And it's very predatory, I mean, over the last 500 years, people have been able to extract the natural resources that they needed to fuel their economies for little or nothing, for a nickel and a dime. And now, as countries have emerged since the Second World War, demanding that they don't get ripped off, that they're not stolen from, this has created a problem. And today we have these new emerging markets, China and so on and so forth, who are just saying essentially that they want to have a fair share. The United States and Europe uses upwards of 80% of the world's energy on a daily basis. That in and of itself is a plan that's destined to cause great problems. So how do the Western countries wean themselves away from their lifestyle?
Yeah.
All right. I'm trying to figure it out here. Okay. Thank you.
I completely agree. The richness of our industrialized countries is almost, I would not say completely, but to a last share due to the, let's say, in a positive, by devasting, by taking out the resources of the other parts, and this has its roots in the colonialism. Why are French countries take out the oil in Algeria? Are the leading companies in Algeria and Libya and so on? Why are Shell started in Indonesia? And so this has its roots in that time. And maybe if you look at it, where are today the conflicts? These are in these areas where we had the largest differences and the largest influence of former colonialist countries. I didn't get in which way. Maybe let me just add.
I'm talking about overload now. I'm saying that you reach a certain point, a point of no return.
Yeah.
Like when you go to the airport, there's V1 and V2. When you reach V2, you better take off.
Yeah.
So in that sense, critical mass, in the sense that the system overheats, it deteriorates, it falls apart.
It's the 2-degree goal of the climate change policy. I guess we cannot reach anymore. But these are, I would not say step functions, even in economic wealth. It's just getting from a smooth transition to each year we delay it. It's getting worse. So it's not a 1-0 transition, but it's getting steeper the later we realize the problems. But just one word to your 2 and 4%. Maybe I was a bit too short. It's for the production cost in industrialized countries. It's roughly between 2 to 4% of the production cost are due to energy. and this is a critic which I do criticize, that they only look to the costs, but the physical input is much more important than only the cost. And what is not there, you cannot use as production input.
Thank you, Dr. Zittel. Please, a big hand for him.